The torches are burning outside the walls. The air is thick with smoke, with fear, with the silence of those who already know their fate. Inside the city, families huddle in darkened chambers. The men sharpen blades, though they know they will die. But the women, they wait, and waiting is worse than death. You hear the rumble of the gates. The shouting grows louder. The ground itself begins to shake. You know the enemy is here. You know there will be no escape. What will happen when the doors break? Will they kill you quickly? Or will your body become the prize of war? Will they drag you through the streets, a symbol of conquest? Or will they take you alive? Because for women, survival is not mercy. It is a different kind of death. Think of it. If you were the queen, the wife of the king, what would they do to you? If you were his daughter, his child, what fate would be waiting? If you were his mother, would you live long enough to watch your sons be slaughtered? And if you were his sister, would your bloodline protect you or condemn you? This is not the history of kings and generals. This is the history of silence. The history of women who lived through the fall of cities and carried the ruins of their people inside their own bodies. And tonight, we will tell it through their eyes. If you were the wife, the queen of a defeated king, the gates have fallen, the screams have begun, and now every step echoes toward the palace. If you were his wife, the queen, what would you feel in this moment? Would you cling to the crown, knowing it means nothing now, or would you beg the conqueror for mercy, knowing mercy has a different meaning for women? History remembers kings who lost their thrones, but it forgets what happened to their wives. They were not spared, they were not honored, they were trophies. When Jerusalem fell in 1099 to the Crusaders, the wives of Muslim rulers and nobles were dragged into the streets. Some were stripped and marched before the soldiers, mocked as symbols of Islam's defeat. Imagine the shame of a woman who once sat on a throne, now paraded naked in front of the very people who once bowed before her. When Constantinople fell in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade, Byzantine noblewomen, including queens, were dragged from their palaces. Chroniclers wrote that even convents were not safe. Nuns and royal wives were stripped, raped, and beaten inside the Hagia Sophia, the holiest church of their empire. For queens, their royal title became a curse. It marked them as the conqueror's prime target. The Mongols used sexual violation deliberately. In Nishapur, 1221, after the city resisted, the Mongols slaughtered nearly everyone. The wife of the city's governor was dragged before them, raped, and killed, her suffering staged as a message to all who would defy the Khan. In Delhi, 1398, when Tamerlane entered, he ordered a massacre. The wives of princes and nobles were not executed immediately. Instead, many were raped by soldiers and later sold in the slave markets. For a queen, conquest did not mean a quick end. It meant degradation stretched across hours, days, sometimes the rest of her life. Not all queens were killed. Some were forced into harems or married to conquerors against their will, their bodies turned into political tools. Alexander the Great seized Persian princesses after defeating Darius. Some became his wives and those of his generals. It was not romance, it was conquest through the womb. The Ottomans, after seizing cities, often took queens and noble wives into their harems. To be a royal wife in a defeated city meant becoming invisible, absorbed into the conqueror's household, forced to bear children for the dynasty that destroyed your own. But perhaps the most brutal fate was not physical. Imagine being a queen forced to kneel before the man who killed your husband. Imagine being forced to smile, to serve, to share his bed, while your family's corpses lay unburied. For queens, survival itself became the cruelest punishment. So if you were the wife, what would it mean? It meant your body was no longer yours. It meant your marriage was torn apart, not by divorce, not by death, but by conquest. It meant that the very bond that made you queen was used to break you. And ask yourself, if you were her husband, if you were the defeated king, what would be worse? To die on the battlefield, or to live just long enough to watch your wife taken by another man while you stood powerless? For queens, the crown was not protection, it was a curse. Because when the city fell, the wife of the king was the first prize the conqueror claimed. But if the queen's fate was sealed in humiliation, then what of the daughter, the child of the dynasty, the bloodline of the future? If you were the daughter of the defeated, the queen was the conqueror's trophy. But if you were the daughter, young, innocent, royal, what would they see in you? You are not a symbol of the past. You are the bloodline of tomorrow, and that makes you dangerous and desirable. Would they force you into a marriage so your blood would be used to strengthen the conqueror's throne? Would you be sent far from your home, a hostage in another palace, your every child raised as a stranger to your people? Or would you be thrown into the market, stripped of your jewels, sold beside common slaves, a princess whose name no one remembers? For daughters, marriage was not a choice. It was a weapon. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, the daughters of King Darius were taken into his camp. One was given as a wife to Alexander himself, others to his generals. To the Persians, these princesses had been heirs to an empire. To the Macedonians, they were wombs to produce children that would erase the Persian line forever. The Mongols perfected this practice. Genghis Khan and Hys's descendants demanded daughters of conquered rulers as wives. Refusal meant annihilation. Acceptance meant survival at the cost of being absorbed into the conqueror's bloodline. A daughter's body became the peace treaty, one written not in ink but in flesh. But not all daughters were kept as brides. Many were stripped of rank and dignity, thrown into the same fate as common captives. When the Crusaders stormed Constantinople in 1204, noble girls, some barely teenagers, were sold to Venetian merchants. Chroniclers record them being dragged from palaces and convents, screaming, their jewels ripped away before they were displayed like merchandise. A princess one day, a slave the next. In Delhi, 1398, Tamerlane's soldiers filled entire markets with noble daughters. Some were bought by wealthy men, others by soldiers for coins. Imagine the terror of a young girl, raised in luxury, suddenly standing on an auction block as men argued over her price. Sometimes daughters were not sold or married, they were destroyed. The Romans were infamous for parading the daughters of defeated kings in their triumphs. Chained, humiliated, and often raped before crowds, their fate was a living execution of their family's pride. Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe IV, was spared death, but she was forced to walk in chains in Rome, humiliated until her execution years later. The Mongols used daughters as public warnings. In Baghdad, 1258, princesses of the Abbasid line were dragged from the caliph's palace. Some were given to soldiers, others raped in the ruins of the libraries and mosques, a message carved into the very heart of Islamic civilization. For daughters, survival was not life, it was captivity. Every child they bore would be half conqueror, half enemy. Every smile they forced would remind them of the screams of their murdered fathers and brothers. And ask yourself, if you were her father, if you were the defeated king, what would break you more? Losing your throne, or watching the conqueror claim your daughter as his bride, his slave, his property? For daughters, conquest meant a stolen future. It meant being forced to carry the blood of the very men who slaughtered your family. It meant your body became the battlefield where dynasties were destroyed and rebuilt. And if the daughter's fate was to be taken for the future, then the mother's fate was to witness it all, powerless to stop what was about to happen. If you were the mother in a fallen city, if you were the mother, you would not fear for yourself first. You would fear for your children, because you know what is about to happen, and you cannot stop it. Would you watch your sons dragged into the streets, cut down before your eyes to end your bloodline? Would you see your daughters torn from your arms, their screams fading as soldiers carried them away? And would you live long enough to hear those screams turn into silence? When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, mothers filled the temple courts clutching their children. Josephus, the historian, describes infants being thrown against walls, sons cut down in front of their mothers, while the women's cries echoed louder than the flames. The intent was clear, to destroy not just the men, but the very possibility of a next generation. In Jerusalem, 1099, when Crusaders stormed the Holy City, they slaughtered tens of thousands. Chroniclers wrote that mothers were killed with babes at the breast, while others were left alive just long enough to watch their daughters dragged into churches. Some were raped inside the very sanctuaries where they prayed. Imagine standing at the altar, begging for God's mercy, while your daughter's cries became the hymn of conquest. When the Mongols took Baghdad in 1258, the city's mothers faced horrors beyond comprehension. Palaces were stormed, infants torn from their arms, some were killed instantly, others were spared, not for mercy but to witness their daughter seized for Mongol harems. A mother's final memory was the sound of her child calling for her, carried into the night by the men who destroyed their world. In Delhi, 1398, Tamerlane ordered his men to fill the slave markets with women and children. Chroniclers record mothers forced to stand beside their daughters, both sold as property. sometimes to different buyers. Imagine watching your daughter dragged in one direction while your hands were bound in another, knowing you would never see her again. For a mother, the sale was worse than death because it tore apart the bond she had carried since birth. For mothers, survival was not a gift, it was a curse. Every scream of a dying son, every cry of a stolen daughter became a wound that never healed. Even if a mother was left alive, she was condemned to live as the witness to her children's erasure. What would break you more, to die with them or to survive and remember? If you are watching this as a parent, ask yourself, what would it mean to stand powerless, your children ripped from your arms? Would you beg for death to join them, or would you live on, carrying the sound of their last screams forever in your mind? For the mother, conquest meant not just pain, but a living death. Because the greatest cruelty was not her suffering, but being forced to watch her children suffer while she was left behind to remember. And if mothers were broken by loss, then sisters were broken by shame. And shame was a weapon more cruel than the sword. If you were the sister of the defeated, if you were the sister of the fallen king, what would your name mean now? Would it protect you, or would it mark you as a target? To the conqueror, you were not simply a woman, you were the dynasty itself, and the fastest way to erase a dynasty was through you. Would you be paraded through the streets, stripped of your robes, so the people could see that your family's power was finished? Would you be forced into the victor's bedchamber, your body turned into the stage on which your brother's humiliation was played out? Or would you be led in chains, a once royal sister reduced to spoils of war? When Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe IV, was captured by Julius Caesar and later brought to Rome, she was forced to walk in chains in his triumphal parade. The crowd jeered, laughed, spat, a queen's sister treated as a spectacle. Though she was not raped on stage, her public humiliation was a symbolic execution. Rome did not need to kill her body that day. They killed her dignity instead. In the sack of Constantinople, 1204, the Crusaders stormed into palaces and convents. Chronicles record nuns, many of them sisters and daughters of noble families, being dragged from their sanctuaries, stripped and raped on the altars of churches. Some were forced to march half-naked through the streets, mocked by soldiers. Imagine what it meant. A sister raised in piety, her body turned into a theatre of shame to erase her family's pride. In the Mongol conquests, sisters of rulers were often taken and distributed to generals, sometimes displayed publicly before soldiers. Their violation was staged as a message. This is what happens to the house that resists us. It was not just sexual violence, it was dynastic extermination. During Tamerlane's campaigns, chroniclers describe sisters of defeated princes forced into slavery alongside common captives. A princess once guarded by walls of marble, now standing in a slave pen waiting to be bought. Their degradation was deliberate, erasing not only their names but the legacy of their blood. For sisters, survival was humiliation. Every whisper, every jeer in the streets reminded them they were not human, they were trophies of shame. And the conqueror knew this. Shame spread like poison, infecting the entire family, even those already dead. If you are watching this and have a sister, imagine her body dragged through the streets, mocked and displayed, not for what she did, but for who you were. Could you bear to watch? Could you bear to live knowing her suffering was the punishment for your defeat? For sisters, conquest meant shame, and shame outlived death. Because even if they survived, their names were stained forever. But if sisters were humiliated for their bloodline, then the wider family, the aunts, cousins, and widows, were erased completely. What happened to them was not just cruelty, it was obliteration. If you were the close family women, if you were not the queen, not the daughter, not the sister, but still bound by royal blood, what would your fate be? Would age protect you? Would distance from the throne shield you? Or would you simply vanish into the same darkness of slavery and shame? To the conqueror, your title meant nothing. Your family name was enough to condemn you. When Baghdad fell in 1258 to the Mongols, the widows of princes and caliphs were rounded up with other women. Some were raped and killed on the spot. Others were kept alive, only to be handed to Mongol officers. A woman who had once walked among marble halls, giving orders to servants, now carried water and food for her captors. In Delhi, 1398, after Tamerlane's sack, entire harems of noble widows were dragged into the slave markets. Their jewelry ripped from their bodies, they were forced to stand in public while men bartered for their price. Imagine the horror of a woman who had once been the wife of a sultan, now treated as livestock in a bazaar. During the sack of Constantinople, 1453, not only queens and princesses, but their nieces and cousins were taken into Ottoman harems. Most were never heard of again. Their names vanished, their voices silenced. They lived out their days as anonymous concubines in palaces far from home. The Assyrians, centuries earlier, had already established this pattern. Relief carvings on palace walls show long lines of women, young and old, noble and common, chained together. Among them would have been cousins, sisters-in-law, and widows of defeated rulers. They are not named, they are not remembered, they are only shadows carved in stone. To be a close kin woman meant that even if you had no claim to the throne, your body could still be used to erase your family's line. Aunts and cousins were forced into harems, raped until they bore children who would grow up as the sons of the conqueror. Older women, too old for soldiers' lust, were still enslaved, cooking, cleaning, laboring until they collapsed. Royal blood was not protection. It was a curse stamped on your body. What made the suffering of these women worse was that no one remembered them. The queens and daughters might be recorded in chronicles, their fates described in blood and tears, but the cousins, the widows, the aunts, they disappeared into silence. And ask yourself, if it were your family, your mother's sister, your cousin, your widowed aunt, would you ever know where they were taken? Would you hear of their death? Or would they simply vanish one night into the void of history? For close family women, conquest meant obliteration. No name in the chronicles, no monument to their suffering, no memory at all. They became invisible. And invisibility is its own kind of death. But if queens were trophies, daughters were stolen futures, mothers were broken hearts, sisters were humiliation, and kin were erased, then what did it mean for all of them together? It meant the unspeakable price of royal blood. The unspeakable price of royal blood. What did it mean to be born royal when the city fell? For men, it meant the sword, a clean end on the battlefield. But for women, the sword was mercy, the psalm, I were rarely given. For queens, it meant being paraded as the first trophy. Stripped, violated, handed from soldier to general. For daughters, it meant their bodies were bargaining chips, married off to erase their lineage, or sold in markets where coins determined their worth. For mothers, it meant the agony of watching sons murdered, daughters seized, and still being left alive to remember it all. For sisters, it meant humiliation, dragged through streets, mocked, raped, displayed as proof that a dynasty was broken. For aunts, cousins, widows, it meant erasure, disappearance into slavery, anonymity, and silence. Royal blood was not glory. Royal blood was not immortality. Royal blood was a curse, because when the city fell, the conqueror made sure to spill it in the most brutal way possible. It happened everywhere. The Assyrians carved it on stone, women of defeated kings, lined in chains, heads bowed, nameless forever. The Romans paraded queens and sisters in triumphs, shaming them before killing them. The Crusaders mocked Byzantine princesses in the very churches they once worshipped in. The Mongols enslaved caliphs' wives, forced them into harems, erasing centuries of royal pride overnight. Tamerlane filled entire slave markets with royal women, their noble names vanishing as buyers haggled over their price. The Ottomans, after Constantinople, turned noble daughters into concubines in faraway palaces, their voices silenced forever. No matter the empire, no matter the century, the story was the same. Think about this. The king's blood might end with a single sword, but the queen's body, the daughter's womb, the mother's memory, these became weapons for the conqueror. A dynasty could be destroyed without killing every man. It could be erased by turning its women into slaves, concubines, and nameless prisoners. And that was the unspeakable price owed. Royal blood. Every crown, every jewel, every title painted a target on the women of the dynasty. Their suffering was magnified 100-fold because of who they were. Would you call it victory if your queen was dragged into the enemy's bed? Would you call it conquest if your daughter was sold like livestock in the market? Would you call it glory if your sister was paraded half-naked through the streets? Would you call it empire if your mother lived on only to remember her children's screams? Across centuries, Assyrians, Romans, Crusaders, Mongols, Timurids, Ottomans, the pattern never changed. When the city fell, men died once. But women died 1,000 deaths and lived to carry them all. The forgotten voices of the fallen, and now the city is silent. The fires smolder, smoke rising into a sky that no longer remembers the names of the dead. The conquerors have taken what they wanted. The gates are broken, the palaces stripped, the thrones toppled. The chronicles will record a victory. They will write about kings and generals, about walls that collapsed and treasures stolen, but they will not write about you. They will not write about the women. Your screams will not be remembered. Your names will not be carved into marble. Your lives will not be sung in poems of conquest. You will exist only as shadows, erased by the same history that erased your freedom. When Jerusalem fell, men wrote of the holy victory, not of the women dragged from the altars. When Constantinople fell, chroniclers described the jewels stolen from Hagia Sophia, not the nuns violated on its steps. When Baghdad fell, they counted the libraries burned, not the caliph's daughters scattered into Mongol harems. When Delhi fell, they recorded the rivers of blood, not the slave markets filled with noble widows and girls priced like cattle. This is the silence of history, a silence heavier than the screams it buried. But you, watching this now, you can imagine. If you are a woman, imagine you were her. The queen paraded as a trophy, the daughter, sold to strangers, the mother forced to watch her children die, the sister humiliated in chains, the cousin who simply vanished, her name never spoken again. And if you are a man, imagine they were yours, your wife, your daughter, your mother, your sister, your family. Would conquest still feel like glory? Would empire still sound like greatness? Or would you see it for what it truly was, a war not only against men, but against women, written into their bodies, erased from the pages of history? This is the truth history rarely tells. For men, defeat meant the sword. But for women, defeat meant 1,000 deaths, humiliation, slavery, rape, and silence. They did not just lose their lives, they lost their names. And they carried the ruins of their cities in their bodies long after the fires went out. When the city fell, kings were remembered, but women were forgotten. And yet it was on their broken backs, in their stolen wombs, and through their silenced voices, that conquest was truly written. If this story shook you, don't let it vanish in silence like the voices of those women. Hit like so more people see it. Subscribe to Auric History so you never miss the hidden truths we uncover. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we learn history together from all around the world.